That's why I drink whole milk. I remember at one point, there was the concern of the fat content, but then there was another study that said people who drink whole milk tend to drink less because it's more. So you just. But it's even the history of church. I'm going on a tangent here, but it's an interesting tangent, so I'll follow it a bit. It's the history of church throughout the ages. If you look at, you have. It's really, frankly, quite amazing how effective the law of Moses, the Old Testament, was at maintaining one identity over a long period of time. If you look at Christianity, over the same time span that you see the nation of Israel, you very quickly see divergence and differences of opinion, differences of thought that lead to splits and different identities and fights between the groups. And not to say that Israel didn't have their own share of infighting as well, but by and large, you didn't see that kind of splintering until much later, really post-Christianity as well. But you can look throughout history and see this pattern where it's like there's a revelation of truth that's accompanied by the outpouring of the Spirit, by the direct revelation of God, and then we start trying to figure it out. Right. And then we have the Word of God, and we have our foundation, and we build something on top of that. And that might actually be mostly right, but then we build on top of that, and then we build on top of that. And within a couple hundred years, we've gotten so far away from a simple reading of the text. We've gotten so far away from the basic presentation of Scripture that you then have these Reformation efforts, right? Where there's a new, someone's hungry to get to truth. They're seeking truth, and the Lord promised that if we sought truth, the Spirit would lead us and guide us to truth. And there's a new revival, and then the cycle repeats. And we end up doing this thing where we overcomplicate it. We start trusting our understanding, and rather than taking the text as it is. So anyways, that was more of a bunny trail that I meant to go on. But one thing I probably want to talk about more later is how do we avoid that, right? If you look at the Pentecostal movement, for example, we're a bit over 100 years into it. We're at a good time to start taking as truth some of the traditions we've created. We have some positions that, we've got our understanding of Scripture that is not directly in the text. There are things that we hold as principles and valuable that I can't point you to a specific verse that says clearly this. So we're at that point where how do we know that what we think is true? And I'll give you the cliff notes for that discussion. And it is that we have examples. So that is, to make a very long subject short, and we may visit later, generally, this is why we call ourselves apostolic Pentecostals, we look to what did the apostles do? If we have a question about doctrine, question about what did Jesus mean when he said this, what did the Old Testament mean, how does it apply, what are we supposed to do as a New Testament church? And it's not, we could argue one way or the other from the text. Well, what did the apostles do? Because they were the ones that walked with Jesus. They were the ones that had the gospel delivered to them directly by God. So if they did it, that kind of settles it for us. And in that train of thought, I thought it would be interesting to take a couple weeks and look at what did Jesus do? Because we often think, I kind of mentioned at the beginning, in Christianity by and large, that the New Testament is a new thing, that it supersedes, replaces the Old Testament. And there's truth in that. This is the new covenant. This is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. But it doesn't really make the Old Testament null and void. Right. It's a greater fulfilling. It's a greater understanding. It completes what the Old Testament is trying to teach us. And so we should see that in the life of Jesus Christ. And in fact, you got this verse if you were here on Wednesdays, but I'll reference it again. In Matthew chapter 5, as part of his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus made this statement before he makes a lot of very difficult statements. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law." This is Matthew 5:17. "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For I truly say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, not a crossing of the T, not a single punctuation mark, not a dot of the I or the J will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And if you want to go further on that train of thought, you can go back and watch our Wednesday live stream, because Brother Gossett went on and touched on a number of the following verses. There is also this passage in Mark 12. So my goal for the next 4 weeks or so is to take some pieces of Jesus' life and look at what he did, see if we can tie it back to Old Testament law. Why did Jesus do this? Because, again, often we see Jesus as Christ, as the founder of Christianity, as the beginning of this new thing. And most Christians are Gentiles, right? I think just by numbers, most of us are not of Jewish lineage. There are many Christians who are Jews, but the majority of us are Gentiles. So we often forget that Jesus was a Jew. If you want to talk about the scripture that Jesus read, it was the Old Testament. Right. If you want to talk about the law that Jesus was following, it was the law of Moses. He was a Jew. And so we see the principles of the Old Testament played out in Jesus' life. So we'll take some kind of pictures of his life. We'll look at some moment in Jesus' life, something he did or something where he was. Try and figure out where that ties into the Old Testament. Try and understand the principle that is in play. And then look at how that applies to us. So, to kind of jump away from, we've been talking about Christian living and kind of Christian ethics, and how is the fact that we're a Christian, should that impact our life? So I'm going to jump away from some of that and make it a little bit lighter. And I want to go to Mark chapter 2. There's a parallel passage in Matthew chapter 12, and we may read both of them because let's start with the one in Mark, and we may come back to the one in Matthew later. Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 23. I realize I didn't give Leo the actual verse back there. All right, Mark 2:23. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields. This is Jesus. Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, Jesus said to them, Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath is not made for man, or the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And there's a larger principle there that's probably worth study, that idea that the Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath. Jesus is asserting his lordship here. But I'm not going to talk about that this morning. We'll talk about that some other time. I want to talk about this thing the disciples were doing. They were walking around, and as they were going along the path, they were plucking produce or grain, ears of grain off of the fields. And they were eating just the raw stuff that they were plucking. Where does that come from? Well, let me take you to Leviticus chapter 23. There's two principles here, two things that are relevant. One is this practice, what the disciples are doing, and two is this idea of Sabbath. If you can bring up Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22. This is in the context of laws about feasts, laws about how they should be governing, and this is in the context of the Feast of Weeks. This is the harvest festival. And the Lord says this in the law he gives them: when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Now, this seems like a pretty simple thing, but do we do this in American society?
Take it all.
Take it all. In fact, anybody who has been a part of leadership, management discussions at some point, you get to this, well, what's our metric? What are we measuring, and how can we make, what's the meme? The line has to go up and to the right, right? That's when I go to present to my boss, as long as the line's going up and to the right, we're good. How can I make the line go up and to the right? How can I find what is it that we're doing? If we're making products, if I'm on an assembly line, I need to make sure the assembly line goes faster today than it did last year. It needs to have tighter tolerances this year than it had last year. We need to be putting out more product with less return this year than we did last year. In my job as a software developer, the common expectation is, someone comes in as a junior, well, they're going to get a certain amount of work done. As they gain seniority, one of the primary things I'm expecting to do is start turning out work faster. And even to the point of, this, if you'll indulge me, this bit me so many times when we'd plan out projects. And it became one of those things in the back of my mind. When someone said it, I knew we were in trouble. When they said, okay, well, this initial phase, we're going to be going slower. But after that first couple months, we'll learn and we'll speed up and we'll get going faster. Whenever I heard that, I knew we're in trouble. Because we're going to plan on a pace that we've never met. We're going to plan on beating our current pace. And we're setting expectations. So this idea that we would purposely leave some of the money on the table, that's the phrase, right? Why are you leaving money on the table? It's there. You should push for it. You should negotiate. You should optimize. There's this hustle culture, right? What are you doing? If you're not busy, are you wasting time? If you're not optimizing your day, have you wasted your day? What can I do to be better? It's another one of those quotes that, on the one hand, has a lot of very powerful truth, but on the other hand, sometimes can be very, that idea, right? If you just improve 1% every day, right? Then in a year's time, I forget the exponential math, but you'll be some massively large percentage better. Well, on the one hand, that's like it's valuable to recognize the value of consistency, right? Compounding effects. If I'm consistent every day and make progress, that progress compounds over time. That's a truth that's worth remembering. On the other hand, sometimes it makes me think if I don't make my 1% today, I'm losing my compounding effect. I've got to make 1% improvement every single day. I've got to find something to improve every single day. Well, I don't think it's an accident that this idea bumps right up into Sabbath law, right? That this idea that you should be not reaping the entire thing so you can leave some extra. It's interesting because in the story with Jesus, it's two separate things, right? The reason that there's stuff left over is because God told them not to harvest the whole field. And the reason Sabbath gets involved is because the Pharisees are angry at them for working on the Sabbath. But there's this deeper connection that the whole point of the Sabbath was to give you space, to give you rest. And in fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, when Moses is recounting this, he points out, when he recounts the Ten Commandments, he says, the Sabbath, remember, you were slaves in Egypt and you didn't get to rest. You made bricks as long as they told you to make bricks. So the Sabbath is a reminder for you that you're no longer in slavery under a taskmaster, but you are children of God, you're the people of God, and he gives you rest. So how ironic that this same principle, when applied to our fields, that we don't optimize to the nth degree, that we don't harvest everything, but we leave some purposely left over for the poor, for those who are passing through. We leave some slop in the system. Seems directly tied to this idea of Sabbath rest. And the Pharisees get it entirely backwards. They're angry at the disciples for taking advantage of the grace that God poured out because it's the Sabbath. And so Jesus, of course, points out, you've got it backwards. You're trying to fit man into this framework that you created for the Sabbath. And the whole reason the Sabbath was created was for man. Now, so the principle in Leviticus is pretty straightforward, but I want to take you to Ruth as well, because we see this again, and I want you to kind of think about the cultural context. To bring you up to speed on Ruth, if you don't remember the story, there was a family that, if you pull up Ruth 1, and I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but I want to at least give you a summary. There was a family, Jewish family, that was moving out of Judah to Moab because of the famine in the area. It was Elimelech and his wife Naomi, and they had sons, so they moved to Moab to avoid the famine. And there's a whole bunch of fascinating history about, like, did they lose their land? Well, no, because Jewish law preserved that land for the family. You couldn't sell it. You could sell it, but at Jubilee you'd get it back because it was their inheritance from God. It was their portion in the Promised Land. We won't go there, but fascinating. So they move to Moab. The sons marry wives up from the Moabites, not Jews. And the father dies, the sons die, and Naomi has nothing left, so she's going to move back to Judah. And, of course, the two daughter-in-laws, the one, Orpah, decides to stay with her people. But Ruth says, no, your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. I want to go with you, Naomi. I want to be part of you. And so they return back to Judah. And, of course, the problem here is that, yes, they will get their land in the time of Jubilee, but it's not the time of Jubilee yet. And they left Judah because there's a famine, and now all the men of the family are gone. So how do you support yourself? And that's where we pick up in Ruth chapter 2, and I'll start at the top. And I do want to read this just to give you kind of an example here. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the land belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And of course, you can continue reading, and you see that Boaz takes a fancy to Ruth, and he provides. He says, don't just go in the fields, but follow after my harvesters, and I'm going to make them leave a little extra just for you. But what I want to show here is this was part of the culture. This was part of how life was done back then, was when they would reap the field, they wouldn't reap the whole field because you had people like Naomi and Ruth that either because they were in poverty or because they were passing through, they didn't have a home in the land. How else were they going to provide for themselves? How else? They didn't have a plot to farm. They didn't have resources to trade for food. So you had to have some way. This was a part of what was going on. This was a normal part of the culture. Now, I want to take you briefly to the Sabbath Law and look at what the Pharisees were so upset about. And if we go to Exodus chapter 20, and let's read in verse 8. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. We have this principle that you don't reap the entire field. You leave some left over. It's not enough that you could make a living off of it. You're not going to be able to bundle it up and be a competitor to the farmer. But it's enough that you could sustain yourself off of it. It's enough that you're not going to go hungry. Keep that in the back of your mind. So what were the Pharisees upset about? Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your livestock, or the sojourner who is within the gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and made it holy. And again, I told you, if we're trying to understand what this means, so the Sabbath seems pretty clear you're not supposed to work. Well, what does work entail? And the Pharisees ultimately had a very long list of all the things that they considered work. And it's ironic, in Jewish culture, there's this idea that God is a God of rules, and his rules are perfect. So he delights in loopholes because he left them there on purpose. And you can just see kind of that whole culture of like, we're going to enumerate all the rules, and we're going to find the loopholes, and we're going to lean on them as hard as we can, because if God left that loophole, it must be there for us. It's just an interesting way to look at this kind of thing.
I find it interesting, Jonathan, that the Lord defined who shouldn't work within the context. He was very clear. You, your family, your spouse, he just goes through this list, but then he just leaves the definition of work as work.
What the work is yes. So, if I'm a Pharisee and I'm trying to understand what this means, here's a text I might go to. Exodus chapter 16. And let's start in verse 22. This is the account of the children of Israel going through the desert and the Lord providing manna. And it points out that the manna came, and here it talks about the sixth day. So now we're about to get to Sabbath intersection with the manna, right? On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning." So they laid it aside till the morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Now, the importance here is a couple verses previous, when God first gave them the manna, they tried to hoard it. They tried to gather as much as they possibly could. And Moses had given them clear instruction: gather just what you need for one day. That was the commandment of the Lord. Just what you need for one day. And they ignored him, and they gathered a whole bunch. And by the halfway, the next morning, it was rotting, and there were worms in it, and it was putrid. And this blessing of God became, this nasty thing. Which there's a whole other train of thought there that's fascinating. I think we've talked about not too long ago. But here, he's saying, grab enough for 2 days now, and bake it and do what you're going to do. And unlike every other day, it's going to keep an extra day. Moses said, verse 25, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." And then they actually messed this up. On the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. Moses told them they would find none, and the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath, therefore on the sixth day he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Don't go out. Don't go looking for manna on the seventh day. Rest." Right. So, if I'm a Pharisee, I might take this verse to understand that I shouldn't be going and harvesting on the Sabbath day. I shouldn't be going and seeking manna on the Sabbath day. That was clearly the violation here. If I know that I'm going to have a day of rest, I should prepare ahead of time for that day of rest, so that when the day of rest comes, I have to work. It's not, God has provided what I need up front. That's the principle of this from this passage here. God provides what you need on a daily basis. And when it's time for you to rest, God will provide what you need to rest. Which again ties back to that principle about the land, of not harvesting all of it. Because remember, is it really the farmer who gives the increase of the crop? No. The farmer has some influence on the circumstances, on the environment of the crop, that it will, he plants it at the right time, he tries to make sure it gets water, but ultimately, especially if you're talking about a farm that's more than just, maybe, like if I've got a garden, I can probably water the garden. If I've got a big farm, especially before modern irrigation, God determines if it's going to rain, and if it rains, the crop can grow. If it doesn't rain, the crop, ultimately, even today, if our reservoirs run empty, we can't control that. And we don't cause the seeds to germinate. We don't cause the plants to grow. That's all the provision of God. So really, this is a recognition that even the produce that we earn by the sweat of our brow, because that's what the curse from Genesis, that we have to work for our food, even that still is the provision of God. And we should recognize that He's given us enough. We don't have to optimize and squeeze every last penny out of what He's given us. He's given us enough, and He's given us enough to have some left over to help others. It doesn't have to be a ton. I don't have to, I'm not putting aside 3 whole fields. I'm harvesting my fields, but I'm not harvesting every blade. God's giving us the manna, and there's enough manna for today. And when Sabbath comes, He's going to give us enough for 2 days. So the underlying principle here is trust God to give you enough. And then that brings us, so there's a number of principles we've touched on. God will provide. God will provide enough. And when God provides, we shouldn't be greedy. We shouldn't try and hoard it for ourselves. And we should be content with what God has provided and leave space for grace. Leave some left over to bless somebody else. Leave some left over to help somebody else. Now, there's one more bunny trail we won't go down today, but worth thinking about. Naomi and Ruth still had to go gather. The people that were hungry still had to go gather. So there is the principle very clearly in Scripture: if a man does not provide for his family, he's worse than an unbeliever, is what it says in the New Testament. And the Old Testament says if he doesn't work, he doesn't eat. So there is a principle of personal responsibility, but there is provision for people that don't have the means. If I have no skill, there's still a provision for me to do something productive and be accounted for. So God provides. Be content with what He gave us. Leave some left over to be a blessing to others. And then remember that God, that same principle at the beginning, God provides. He provides a rest. He provides enough. So you don't have to push. You have a time to rest. So when we come to, now let's come back to the example from Jesus' life, and we'll close up here and revisit what they did. Let's go to the one in Matthew this time, Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 1. It's a parallel passage. It says things a little bit different. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." And Jesus said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? And those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him to eat, nor those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So if we're trying to understand this application of these principles of God will provide enough, God will give extra, and God has told us to rest, and He's given us rest that we should take advantage of. How do we resolve those? Well, look at how Jesus resolved them. When you were hungry, eat. Later on, He heals a man. It's the same passage. Just after this, He heals a man on the Sabbath. And again, the Pharisees are upset because He's doing work on the Sabbath. And He uses this example. Wouldn't you, if you had an animal that fell into a ditch, would you leave the animal there to die because it's the Sabbath? No, you would pull the animal out. Right? What is the point of the Sabbath law? The Pharisees got it backwards, where they were trying to keep the law at the expense of the people the law was intended to protect, and not understanding the principle of the law. Sabbath was intended to give rest, to give space. It wasn't intended to cause people to starve because they didn't have food. It wasn't intended to make people remain in pain and illness because they're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. So how does this apply to our lives? And actually, I'll pause here and I'll ask you, how do these principles apply today? We don't have fields. It's not quite the same thing. How can we apply this principle? God gives us enough, and He gives us enough to bless others. Any ideas? I know I'm pulling a switch on you here, and I'm asking for audience participation at the very end. Not typical. Tithing. Absolutely. Time. What do you mean?
Giving your time set aside to help other people would be the same as saving some of the field for other people. You set that time aside knowing someone's going to ask you for help. You show up, not just, I'll help anytime
Right. I want to help. I want to help. I'm sincere, but I don't actually make space in my calendar for it to happen.
I think too, also the principle that when you do give and you're willing to, God takes that and He brings the blessing back to you. So if you're willing to leave that extra, you will find over time that He will bless you in ways that are not comparable to what you gave, if that makes sense.
Yes. I think one of the things in talking, and it feels like talking to coworkers, talking to people in my life, one of the big struggles in our society is to figure out what safety nets should we build. What and how do we make those effective? How do we help people who are legitimately down on their luck, who need assistance, without the whole system crumbling because of the people who are going to take advantage of the system? And the only thing I've seen in my 30-something years of I wasn't watching politics this whole time, but watching policymakers for 10, 20 years, is we have no idea. We create programs with good intentions that get abused. We create programs with poor intentions that seem to work, and we don't really have a good idea of, there's so many possibilities. Let me take those three answers. I tithe. I trust God with my first fruits, and I trust Him to anoint those who have that tithe. We as a church want to be one of those safety nets where we have some extra. We're not rich. We have a building program coming up. We need resources, but we trust God to provide. And we're not going to be stingy with what He's given us. If we can help somebody, we're not, again, we don't have a whole field, but we've got some leavings from the harvest that we have that we can make available to someone who needs help. That's part of the purpose of a healthy church, is to be a place where people can get help. Not because the church is making money, but because the church is drawing on the resources of the community and creates opportunity to help. Time is the same thing. And I would even apply this not just in, this is a good thing in expectation management in general. I'm never going to commit 100% of my time. I'm going to expect to get things done with 80% of my time, and I'm going to trust God to anoint me and bless me so that I can be effective with that 80% time, so that I've got some extra time to help my coworkers, to help my family, to help others, to have some leftover energy to give. And then we've got to trust that God is enough, and He will give us enough. And if we don't maximize, if we're not greedy, if we can be content with less than everything He's given us and dedicate some to Him, He will bless what we give. He will bless the bit that we have, and He will allow us to do more with that 80-90% of money left, more with that 80-90% of time left than we would have with the 100% if we were trying to squeeze every penny out. So, He is the God of enough. I think that's come up in a number of our lessons. So I hope this has been an interesting look at Jesus, at the Old Testament. The thing is, these principles were there from the beginning, and we get so caught up sometimes in the details of the ceremonial law that it can be easy sometimes to miss the pattern that's underneath it. And Jesus didn't come to abolish the Old Testament law, but to fulfill it. So we'll take some time in the next 3 weeks as well to do this kind of analysis again. Look at something Jesus did. Where does that come from? What's the principle? Because Jesus applied it differently than the Pharisees of the day. Who was right? Well, Jesus. How does it apply to us? Thank you for your time. God bless, and we'll have our main service here in a couple minutes.